In China, talking to us that are in South African agriculture, we continue to face higher tariffs in China.
US President Donald Trump has chosen this time to warn that an additional 10% tariff can be levied on any country aligned with anti-American policies of BRICS countries. What do you think of that?
There's always been this tone of saying, okay, if we dip in BRICS, then we can lessen the Western world. We can't, because I've said that the US is about 4% of our agricultural exports. But the African continent, which is largely not part of the BRICS, accounts for about half of South Africa's agricultural exports. The EU accounts for about 19% of South African agricultural exports. So you have about 2/3 of your export markets being the EU as well as the African continent. So whatever we do, either in BRICS or deepening our exports in China, India, and elsewhere, it must be an addition, not a replacement of what we...
Guys, so this political analyst here, Wandile Sihlobo, is making some really intelligent analysis regarding South Africa's position with China and the US, arguing that it wouldn't simply be a smart move to simply dump the US and move left to China, as we see the EFF and MK, clamoring, so to speak, if they get into power. And his analysis is top notch. I think he's along the lines of Dowie Ruth, economist Dowie Ruth. I think this guy is somebody we have to really keep watching, because it really is such a smart analyst. The way he analyzes, he's explaining, first of all, that South Africa is an export-based economy, all right? And this export has actually established infrastructures and a certain trajectory to exporting, especially in its cooperation with the US. Now, to simply break out of that in the event of maybe a shift to a BRICS, he argues that the BRICS lacks an economic, what he calls an economic ambition, and that most of the exports from South Africa haven't been going to the BRICS countries. I think there have been a majority of South Africa's export has been going to the US. Now, the BRICS countries as well do not also, basically anyway, he argues that the exports that actually go out of South Africa that has been, at least keeping the economy of South Africa at bay in a way, most of those exports have been going to Africa, other African countries, and then the EU. All right, other African countries and the EU import a lot of South Africa's products, especially also the US. All right, it seems that most of these exports haven't really been going to China, or maybe the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So now to shift its policy away, without setting infrastructure, certain solid arrangement. Also, if you consider the wake of the fact that on October the 1st, Trump has decided to slam South Africa with a 30% tariff on the commodities coming from South Africa to the US. This is now minus the AGOA thing that is being threatened, but this was in terms of its alignment to BRICS. So although many people in South Africa see it as a taunting, as a sort of like a bully move and all of that, I think Trump is clear. Trump really is clear. I've also heard that Jonas Msebisi, who was actually stationed to be the new ambassador to have replaced the former ambassador of South Africa to the US, who actually had that video that caused a lot of crisis for his own profession. Jonas Msebisi, the new one, actually hasn't had his visa. I think I saw a video that he's also having he's experienced a lot of challenges in beginning his own job. He's been having visa issues as well. It appears that the US is actually also rejecting him as an option. It's just crazy what's happening to South Africa in this stage. And so this economist is actually arguing that to totally decide to just shift from the US, because if probably an EFF and MK coalition comes into power, for example, and they decide that, okay, we want to get rid of the US, throw the US away, let's shift to our partners in China, in Russia, and all of that. This economist is arguing that there hasn't been a build-up of infrastructure, of networks that have actually allowed this trade flourish over time as it had done with the US, all right? So that kind of total shift would really create a really intense shock that, might even result in a worsening of South Africa's condition, knowing fully well that we have the massive In fact, I was listening to a podcast the other day. It says that South Africa has the largest unemployment in the world, the largest murder rate in the world. That was after Trolley of the Action essay. Well, as an essay seems to be leading in unemployment and murder. And to have that kind of, so I think there has to be tactics. South Africa's leadership now has to be tactful in its trade decisions. And what I'm beginning to see with South Africa-US relations going forward, I think it's getting into a really red zone where I'm really hoping that the feedback loops will not be one that affects the unemployment. For me, I think I've come to realize that the unemployment handouts is really vital for the society, because now it's at a tipping point where if you do not assist those guys who get those SASA, bro, the next day there might be a revolution in South Africa. So that's what I'm beginning to see. And if there's not enough tact to really follow up these switches and decisions in trade, this analyst here, Wandile Sibolo, argues that there might be disaster coming, which South Africa's leadership has never ever seen. So let's quickly listen to him. Really powerful. And I don't listen to trash. I listen to thinkers, people who think politically, analytically. And this Wandile Silobo is somebody we have to look out for, probably, and even maybe get him to this channel to have a podcast. But let's quickly listen to his analysis on why it is that for China to replace the US in terms of especially agricultural exports in South Africa is a no-go area for now, and share your thoughts in the comments.
Time seems to be running out. What strategy does the South African government have in place to deal with the tariff fallout?
Chris, I think the point I would start off with is to say, for us in agriculture, we are export oriented. I mean, the South African agricultural sector exports roughly $13.7 billion of agricultural products a year to the world market. At least that's in 2024. If you think then about how big the US is in that $13.7 billion US dollars, it's about roughly $500 million, about 4% of our exports go to the US. And I know some people may think, okay, then that's relatively small. We shouldn't be worried a bit about it. But it's concentrated in a few important industries. You have citrus, nuts, wine, table grapes being amongst those products that are there. And of course, our friends in the ostrich industries, they are all amongst that 4%. So that market is super important to them. But it's also super important in terms of the provinces. You have the Western Cape, Mpumalanga, all of these provinces that are exposed in the production of these products. That becomes important. So we have to work to continuously accessing the US market. Of course, we know that the South African government had engaged with the US at the end of June in Luanda to present the South African offer. That offer that they presented benefited from the inputs of the private sector. The miners, the agriculturalists, autos, and many others, they made their input on that. It's unclear then how much of that was taken into consideration leading up to announcements that we had seen on the 7th of July coming out of the White House. The very hope then is to say, where to now? Where to now? It's really about listening to what the US puts on the table about what they demand and seeing what South Africa can continuously improve on the offer that we have. Because we cannot just substitute the US. It remains super important to us in agriculture. And I think that if you talk to our friends in the mining industry, in the auto industry, and the others, you will get a similar message of saying, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and improve what we have so that we continue to secure the US market because of its value.
Now, people have stated repeatedly that we should diversify. And there are many people who feel we should just tell the US to go. There's China. How realistic is that?
I mean, I hear, Chris, a lot of people would say, look, for example, you people in agriculture, why are you sweating about the 4%? Why can't you go to other markets and switch and look elsewhere in the world? But the reality is that there's a number of things there. One, we cannot just switch a market overnight and take up all of the things and go to the next market, because there's a supply chain dynamics and a relationship infrastructure and all of that is built over the years so that you are able to export to one country. But the second aspect is also about whether the other markets really do have better terms of trade, better tariff arrangements. And I can tell you this, in China, talking to us that are in South African agriculture, we continue to face higher tariffs in China. If you are sitting in the Western Cape and thinking about exporting wine to China, you face tariffs of between 14 and 20%. If you are in Pumalanga thinking about exporting macadamia to China, you face tariffs of about 12%. So switching to China is not as easy because we don't have also a trade agreement with China. And even if we were to have the trade agreement with China, I think that will involve a lot more of firstly dealing with the logistic and establishing the business dealings on that. Even if we were to go that path, the strategy that we are looking at as South African agriculture is rather export diversification on building and opening up as many export markets as we can. If you talk to anyone that is in the fruit industry, they will tell you that over the next couple of years, next 5 years or so, the South African fruit production will expand by plus 30% on just the trees that are already planted. Now, that produce will not be for the domestic market. We already export about half of what we produce in South Africa. So much of that produce will need to go to the export markets. So the export diversification should continue, but not as a replacement to the US, but on building up the room so that much of the products that we will be producing will go to those new export markets. And I think the export diversification should be looked at in that way. And I mean, you and I have talked in previous conversations that the South African government still has over 2 million hectares of land to be planted. If you consider then even that land, when it is fully planted and it is now in production, much of the produce that will come out there will need to go somewhere, which again builds on the story of the export diversification. But I would be quick to say the US, no one is aiming and looking at replacing it, but rather the diversification is really building on the capacity to export elsewhere, while we should mend relations with the US because we have those business arrangements and it is an important market for us. It may look like 4%, but it is key to certain subsectors.
Now, BRICS is being held in Brazil at the moment, and US President Donald Trump has chosen this time to warn that an additional 10% tariff can be levied on any country aligned with anti-American policies of BRICS countries. What do you think of that?
I mean, look, BRICS grouping, looking at it purely from an agricultural perspective in South Africa, at this moment, it lacks the economic ambition. It is an important grouping of countries. When you're looking at it, it accounts for roughly half of global agricultural trade. But if you were ask me then and say, look, in the $13.7 billion of agricultural exports of South Africa to the world in 2024, how much of that actually go to the BRICS countries? The BRICS countries account for less than 10% of our agricultural exports. The reason for it is not so much that BRICS doesn't import food. The BRICS grouping, just the original member countries before now the addition of the other countries, were spending a year over 200 billion US dollars importing food products from the world market. But South Africa was still a very small part of that. And of course, China was a big part of those imports, as well as India. The key issue that we face in the BRICS countries are the higher tariffs, the ones that I've just mentioned in China. But in India, you get the similar matter whereby you are confronted by tariffs and you are also confronted by what we call the phytosanitary barriers. Those are the biological way of how you grow and handle your products, how you handle your meat products, and all of those things. And as a result, they limit the trade in this grouping. And this is not the story of only South Africa. If you look at the intra-trade in agricultural products in BRICS, it's still fairly low. The number of countries that end up exporting to the BRICS are the ones that are outside of that grouping. And my sense is that for South Africa and even some of the exporting countries, Brazil and the others, I think the wish is for us in BRICS to come up with something that I would call a BRICS agricultural trade agreement, or whatever protocol that would actually deal with lowering the tariffs and then encourage trade in this grouping. Because if we don't do that, we'll continue then getting all of the political headwinds that you're experiencing, either from the US president or elsewhere. But some people, as they have often said to me, that we get much trouble from BRICS, but we are not getting paid for it. And I do think that to a certain extent, they are right about that. And we have to argue for the members of BRICS to deepen trade. And they can do that by formally coming up with the BRICS agricultural trade agreement. But Chris, I will be quick to say, even if we do come up with the BRICS agricultural trade agreement, that is not and should not be a replacement of the US or the other markets. And there's always been this tone of saying, okay, if we dip in BRICS, then we can lessen the Western world. We can't, because I've said that the US is about 4% of our agricultural exports. But the African continent, which is largely not part of the BRICS, accounts for about half of South Africa's agricultural exports. The EU accounts for about 19% of South African agricultural exports. So you have about 2/3 of your export markets being the EU as well as the African continent. So whatever we do, either in BRICS or deepening our exports in China, India, and elsewhere, it must be an addition, not a replacement of what we are trying to do in here. Because again, we are an export-oriented agricultural sector that is looking to advance in a number of markets.